welcome back. And of course, if you are new to this channel, welcome. My name is Tracy, and now that it is finally October, it is now Halloween Spooktacular, where I will post a spooky video each and every day in the month of October. So be sure to click subscribe down below and then click on that notifications bell so that you can be notified each and every time that I upload a new video. And in today's Halloween Spooktacular video, we are going to discuss Betty and Barney Hill's UFO sighting. So stay tuned. UFOs, or unidentified flying objects, have been ever growing in popularity ever since right around the 1950s, or give or take. But it was right around the time where the space race had begun, and so people turned their attention towards all of the possibilities that outer space have to offer us, including the possibility of other life forms originating from other galaxies far, far away. Last summer, my dad even told me that he thought that he saw a UFO. His story to me was that he woke up in the middle of the night, right around 3 a.m., and decided to go sit outside on his deck. And that is when he claimed to have witnessed a UFO, which in his description was a flat, disc-shaped flying object that seemed to have red lights all around it. So I seemed to actually believe his story, and as it seems, I was the only family member really who truly believed that my dad actually did see a UFO. I actually believed my dad's story about seeing the UFO outside that night last summer in 2019. And so that actually got my curiosity kind of going on UFOs. So I decided to do a little research for myself and began looking into popular encounters with unidentified flying objects. And so in my research, of course, I came across the story of Betty and Barney Hill, who were actually the victims of the first documented alien abduction. In this video, we're actually going to talk about their UFO sighting, which is the beginning of Betty and Barney Hill's story. In the next video, I will tell you guys all about the alien abduction as well. So let's start at the beginning. Betty and Barney Hill's friendship began in the summer of 1956. When Betty was working for a bed and breakfast that Barney actually visited with his wife and children at the time. Now, it wasn't until later when Barney's marriage had actually fallen apart and he then divorced his wife, and that is when he and Betty had reconnected and just decided to start a friendship together. Now, that friendship over time just kind of developed into more of an intimate relationship between Betty and Barney. And so they actually made their relationship official when they decided to be married in May of 1960. The beginning of Betty and Barney's marriage, they actually had to live rather far apart from each other based on where their jobs were located. So Betty was a social worker and she lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Barney was a city carrier with the United States Postal Service, and he was working in Philadelphia. Now, it wasn't until May of 1961 that Barney finally got transferred to a different post office that was much closer to Betty, so that he could finally see his wife more often and spend some precious time together, so that they could finally really get to know what it's like to live a semi-normal married life. Finally, in September of 1961, Betty and Barney Hill decided to take a little road trip so that they could actually finally have a honeymoon. And so they packed up their car and they packed their dog Delcy, and Barney even placed Betty's handgun under the floor mat of the car, just in case they ran into anything strange along the way. But after packing up the car, they headed on over to Niagara Falls, and they also made a short visit in Montreal. Now, as Hurricane Esther began to move closer to the eastern coast, Betty and Barney decided it was probably best to get back home to their house before the hurricane actually made landfall, so that they could prepare the home for any of the storms that were coming. Betty and Barney had decided to cut their honeymoon a little bit short to head home and prepare for the impending hurricane that was coming in. And by their estimations, they could make it home as long as they just drove straight through. But if they got tired, they decided that, it would be fine if they pulled over and rented a room somewhere, or even slept in the car if they had to. They felt pretty safe with their dog as well as the handgun. So that brings us to September 19th into the 20th of 1961. And that is the night that Betty and Barney Hill would never forget for the rest of their lives. As they were headed home, they were getting actually quite a bit closer, and they were traveling through the mountains in New Hampshire on Route 3. And that's when Betty began to notice what she at first thought was a shooting star in the sky. She began to watch the erratic movements of this alleged star, and then decided that it was possible that it was actually a satellite, because her father was actually very interested in satellites and had told her all about them, and would even go out looking for satellites in the nighttime sky. So after shooting star was kind of crossed out as an option, Betty decided to chalk it up as a satellite. But then she began to watch it a little closer still. And that is when she began to see very strange movements of this aircraft. And the aircraft actually stopped in midair and then just ascended. And that is when Betty saw the craft actually cross the face of the moon. And so Betty asked Barney to pull over to take a look into the binoculars to, take a look at what she had been seeing to see what he thinks it is. So Barney pulled over the car and he opened the car door to get a clearer look. And that's when he finally noticed through the binoculars that it really was moving in erratic ways. It wasn't acting like a normal object that you would see flying through the sky and working with your normal laws of physics, so to speak. Barney also noticed at that time that it seemed to be a flattened disc shape, and he also noticed the red lights on the disc as well. Betty and Barney decided to continue on their journey, but they were still remaining awestruck at this object that was flying through the sky. They kept their eye on the light that they could see in the sky, and they continued to make note of the erratic movements of the flying object. And basically, they would sometimes pull over and just kind of check it out once again. But in general, it was staying quite far away from them, so they were just making note of it and kind of keeping track of it for a little while as they drove down the highway. As Betty and Barney came around a slight curve, they then came to an opening and a field, and that is when the flying object was just above their vehicle, and from what they could tell, it was only about 80 to 100 feet, hovering just above them silently. This is when Barney slams on the brakes and stopped the car right there in the middle of the highway. He got his binoculars and grabbed the gun from under the floorboard of his car. And then as he walked closer, he looked through the binoculars at this object in the sky. And that is when he could see that there were 2 rows of rectangular windows all around this flying disc. And inside of the windows, he was able to see humanoid-like figures that he stated were moving around, similar to what reminded him of German soldiers. Barney said that he felt incredible terror, and that he also felt as though this humanoid figure was actually communicating with him telepathically. And all of a sudden, Barney mustered up all the strength that he could and ran back to the car where he was panicking and telling Betty that they had to go. He felt as though they were going to capture them. So Barney sped in his car along Route 3 once again. And this time, the flying saucer seemed to be following them. And all of a sudden, Barney and Betty heard this buzzing sound. And at the same time that this buzzing sound was heard, they felt a vibrating that was penetrating the entire vehicle. And this obviously scared them as well, but they just continued driving down the road. A few miles down the road, they heard that buzzing sound again, and once again, they felt the vibrating penetrating the entire car. And all of a sudden, they had some memories of a roadblock. Memories of a glowing, fiery ball in the way of the road. And the next thing you know, they were home once again, and the sun was starting to come up. Barney and Betty had actually assumed that they would be home probably around 3 a.m. but they didn't arrive home until 5 a.m. And they're still not quite sure what happened to the missing time from that night on Route 3 in the mountains of New Hampshire. So, as I was researching Betty and Barney Hill, I actually found this book captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience. And this book was actually written by Betty Hill's niece. And so she actually shares Betty Hill's diary entry from the morning that they arrived home after this experience. And so I'm going to share that diary entry with you right now. So Betty wrote, "We entered our home, turned on the lights, and went over to the window and looked skyward. We stood there for several minutes. Then Barney said, 'This is the most amazing thing that has ever happened to me.' We both wondered if they would come back." She recorded Barney's comment at her that their arrival time was shortly after 5 a.m. And so it was later than it was expected. And so then she also wrote, "We felt very calm, peaceful, relaxed. We sat at the kitchen table, looked at each other, shook our heads in puzzlement, and asked each other, 'Do you believe what happened?' We agreed that it was unbelievable, but it had really happened. We would return to the windows and always look skyward." And so in that next day, obviously they got some rest. And then after that, they decided to discuss a little bit about what had gone on and what they remembered. And so Barney came up with this idea to each of them go into a separate room and then draw as close to they can an image of what they remember seeing that night on the highway. And so they did. Betty and Barney went into separate rooms and they drew from their memory what they remember seeing in the sky that night. And when they were both done, they came back together and they were actually very surprised by all of the similarities in each other's drawings of the spacecraft. So they couldn't deny that they were imagining it because they both saw something so eerily similar. After they compared their drawings, Barney decided to tell Betty that he did not think it was a good idea to share their story with other people. And so after some time had passed, that peaceful and relaxed feeling that they had that morning when they arrived home had actually subsided. And that feeling was replaced with more uneasiness. And they were actually a little bit scared about what had happened to them at this point. And so Betty decided to go against Barney's judgment to not tell anyone. And she decided to call her sister, Janet Miller, and she shared the experience with her. Now, the reason why Betty thought that Janet would be the perfect person to tell the story to is because her sister Janet actually claimed to have seen a UFO once in the past herself. So in the mid 1950s, Janet was on her way home from a shopping trip when she said that she claimed there was a UFO or unidentified flying object flying through the sky that she, along with many other people, had witnessed at that time. And so because of that being a part of Betty's sister's perception, Barney and Betty thought that it would be fine to share this story with her. Now, after Betty told her all of this, she actually suggested, because of the suggestion of a friend actually, to take a compass out to the vehicle and to move it around to different areas of the vehicle and to see if the compass does anything strange. And so Betty takes the compass outside into the rain, but she was able to see the compass because she actually had the car parked right under a street light in front of the house. Barney did not want anything to do with this little experiment, so he decided to stay inside. So Betty by herself went outside, and that's when she noticed on the trunk of the car, there were some little round spots on the back of the car that were extra shiny. It's almost as though they were buffed to a very keen shine, and she found that to be odd. As she moved the compass around the vehicle, she didn't notice any strange movement or anything strange happening with the compass. But then, when she placed the compass over those shiny spots on the back of the trunk, the compass needle started spinning like crazy. And so Betty ran inside and told Barney all about it. He came out, he tried it, he realized the exact same thing that Betty did. Now, this did not get them excited at all. This actually made Betty and Barney rather fearful for what had happened to them, because now they had these strange spots on the trunk of their car, which are also reacting strangely to a compass being held to them. This was definitely becoming a very strange story. So Betty invites her sister over. They wait for the rain and hurricane to pass through, and then they come to Betty and Barney's house to discuss what had happened. And that's when Betty and Barney Hill were told that it might be a good idea to report their experience to the Peace Air Force Base in the area. And so that's exactly what they did as their next step. A couple of other strange things to note about this little encounter that Betty and Barney had with the UFO is that at some point on the night of September 19th into the 20th of 1961, both Betty and Barney Hill's wind-up watches stopped working, and they were irreparably damaged on that night. Now, because it is a winding watch, unfortunately, they aren't sure exactly if they stopped working at the exact same time, because when they first noticed that the watches were no longer working, they simply thought that they needed winding. And so therefore, we're not quite sure what time the watches stopped. But the next day, they did notice that they couldn't be wound and they no longer worked. So they were then broken. And another thing, Barney's pants ended up to be covered with burrs and other plant matter from outside. And his nice dress shoes that he had been wearing for this trip were actually very scuffed up and damaged on the top of the shoe in an unexplainable way. Barney wasn't quite sure how his shoes got scuffed on the very top of them. Now, the plant matter, on the other hand, could be explained because Barney did walk into a field with the binoculars when he walked towards the UFO at one point. But the shoes, that's another thing. Now, Betty also has a rip in her brand new blue dress, and she doesn't remember the dress having such a rip before seeing it the next day. And then, of course, you have to remember there is the factor of, by their estimate, they were to be arriving home by 3 a.m., and instead, they did not arrive home until shortly after 5 a.m. There are just so many unexplainable things that happen to them in this little experience. So I don't know. Let me know what you guys think down below and we'll talk about it. But in the meantime, make sure that you click that notifications bell so that you can see when I upload the next video all about the abduction. Well, that about wraps it up for this video. So if you like this video, be sure to click that like button. And if you're a viewer but not yet a subscriber, be sure to click subscribe right under this video. And once you have subscribed, you can then click the bell to be notified each and every time that I upload a new video. Thank you guys so much for watching and spending your time with me. I love you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.